So in addition to Billy and I co-chairing this conference, we have a third co-chair, which is Bart Trees. Bart actually graduated from our online master's program on sustainable transportation. He's a Husky, and he worked for WashDOT for multiple years and coming back to be the director of the Mobility Innovation Center. Very cooperative, so we have a lot of great plans. So this is actually our kickoff to work together. Bart, I would like to introduce you here, and you introduce the panel. Thank you.
Either have to crouch down or bring the microphone up. Thank you, Yin-Hai. I'm very pleased to be here. It's great to be on campus, see a bunch of familiar faces. I'm Bart Trees, the director of the Mobility Innovation Center at the University of Washington. I'm pleased to present the plenary session and invite Loriana Marciante. She is the principal technologist for Mobility, Equity, Climate at HNTB. She's on my Mobility Innovation Center Advisory Board, and really happy to have her and some other familiar faces on the plenary session. So Loriana, if you want to join me up here, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here to talk about a really interesting topic, which is money. Money for transportation. So I'm delighted to have here representatives from Washington Department of Transportation, Oregon Department of Transportation, Idaho Department of Transportation, and Association of Washington Cities. So I'm going to call them up, and then I'm going to join you in the table, and we can have a little bit more of a discussion. So Megan Cotton is the Tribal and Federal Relations for Washington Department of Transportation. We also have Margaret Pridmore, Roadway Data Manager from Idaho Department of Transportation. Travis Brower, we've got he's Assistant Director for Revenue, Finance and Compliance, Oregon Department of Transportation. And Brandy DeLange, Government Relations for Association of Washington Cities. So I'm going to transition over here and join you. So, is it working? Yeah? No? Oh boy. Is it better? Yeah. Okay. It is working, but we got to move it around. So, I'm going to allow a little bit of time for each of you to introduce yourselves, your role, and how this funding is going to relate to you. So I thought, as you're introducing yourself, it'd be interesting if you could share a little bit of what you see the IIJA, or the bipartisan infrastructure law is what it's currently being called, or the deal as well. So what do you see this that is exciting you as well? And maybe before we go too much into that, I can share a little bit of what the infrastructure law is all about. So let me back up again. So let me give you some of the headlines. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is referenced as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as well. They also call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal. It is really a $1.2 trillion package, being called once in a generation. You might have all read the headlines, but it will rebuild America's roads, bridges, and rails, expand access to clean drinking water, ensure every American has access to high-speed internet, tackle the climate crisis, advance environmental justice, and invest in communities that have too often been left behind. It will drive the creation of good-paying union jobs and grow the economy sustainably and equitably so that everyone gets ahead for decades to come. I mean, that's a big job for a law. So it is a 5-year package, but some of us who have been around a little bit know that these tend to last a little longer sometimes. So it is a really important framework for how we're going to fund infrastructure potentially over the next 10 years. So some of the numbers, and you might have heard this, but I think it's important and worth repeating before we start talking about it. We have $110 billion for road and bridge repair in support of major transformational projects. Just for our bridges, we have $40 billion. That's the largest dedicated bridge investment since the construction of the interstate system. For rail, we have $66 billion. largest federal investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak. Transit, $89.9 billion, largest federal investment in public transit ever. We have airports, $25 billion, ports, $17 billion, power infrastructure and clean energy transmission, which is very relevant now to transportation, right? Didn't used to be, but now it is. So we have $65 billion, and electric vehicle chargers, $7.5 billion. So combined, this is the largest investment in clean energy transmission and electric vehicle infrastructure in the US history. Then we also have resilience against climate change related natural disasters. Money, $50 billion for our infrastructure to become much more resilient. And then clean drinking water, $55 billion. Broadband, $65 billion. And this is where it's really important, ensuring that every American has access to reliable high-speed internet, pretty much the backbone of anything smart city, smart region, smart community. And then cybersecurity, $1 billion, which probably needs a little more than that. No, so it also includes first ever safe streets and roads for to support projects to reduce traffic fatalities, which we know it's been a really problem, and it's increasing after the pandemic. So it's a really important problem we've been tackling for years. And it'll fund new programs to support development, demonstration, and deployment of cutting-edge clean energy technologies to accelerate our transition to a zero-emission economy. And that part is the part I'm most excited about. But I'd love to know what you do at your agencies, and what parts are you most excited about of the IIJA?
Sure. Do you want to just go down the line? Sure.
All right. Good morning. Again, my name is Megan Cotton. I'm the Tribal and Federal Relations Director for WAJDOT. With my federal role, I'm our agency's point person with the delegation and on major legislation such as this. So we worked really closely with our congressional delegation in the development of this package, and there are several things we're really excited about. The level of investment is unprecedented. We depend a lot on our federal funding to help preserve what we have, but there are several new programs that are going to be really impactful. Ferries electrification is one that we're really excited about. There is funding for resiliency and to help us fix our fish barrier culverts, which is going to be important. And then there was also several new programs, grant programs in particular, that are going to help with some of our largest, most complex projects, including the Interstate Bridge project between Oregon and Washington. And so, yeah, there is a lot in this bill. I will be honest, with capacity, I'm mostly focused on the stuff within the transportation realm. I know that this is big I infrastructure, and there's a lot in water and utilities and broadband and things like that. But you know, in the transportation sector, there's a lot to be excited about.
I'm Margaret Pridmore. I'm with the Idaho Transportation Department. I'm the roadway data manager in our traffic operations unit. I'm also the Highway Safety Improvement Program Manager, and I'm on our data steering committee for our organization. And for us, we're looking at the opportunities to partner with local agencies, with other federal and state agencies. To give you an idea, in 2010, I believe our population was 1.6 million people. By the end of this year, they're estimating it's going to be over 2 million. So we have been, for the last decade or more, one of the fastest growing states in the country. For several of those years, we were the fastest growing state in the country. So as you can imagine, our infrastructure has taken a hit. And a couple of years ago, we started getting additional funding from the state, but it still was going to be questionable whether or not we're going to be able to keep up with the demands of more and more people moving into our state, and particularly our urban areas and some of our infrastructure like bridges and how they were going to handle it. So we're looking at the opportunities we have to partner with other agencies to use the funds as it's going to best meet those demands that are coming in so rapidly. And from a practical standpoint, as the HSIP program manager, I'm looking at what we're going to be able to do from research in moving towards centralizing our data systems, making the data available to particularly our rural communities. We are very much a rural state with small pockets of urbanness, the largest being in southwest Idaho with Boise and Nampa urban areas. But in general, most of our state is very rural, and most of the people most of the highway districts and local agencies don't have large staff. They don't have the ability to gather their own resources. So they look externally to find out where they can get them. And with our strong partnership with our local Highway Technical Advisory Council, we try and get as much information as we can out to them. And so some of the research that we're going to be doing here in the future is going to help enhance a lot of that.
So I'm Travis Brower. I'm the Assistant Director for Revenue Finance Compliance for Oregon DOT. And in that role, I always say that the shortest way to think of me is the money guy. All the money flowing into the department through the DMV, through our taxes on heavy trucks, through our fuels tax, comes through the divisions that I oversee, and all the money going out as well from finance and budget and our capital program as well. So I oversee our statewide transportation improvement program, and so spent the first several months of this year rapidly scrambling to figure out how to spend $1.5 billion very quickly. It was a good problem to have, though. So I will tell you that I think the thing I'm most excited about in the IIJA is really some of the shift of the federal programs that focus more on sustainability in particular. I think I agreed with every word that Professor Sperling said earlier. There's one point where you said that nobody goes in with a spreadsheet to buy an electric vehicle. I actually did, but I'm one of the finance guys you mentioned. It was wrong, but I did compute total cost of ownership, and it was cheaper. So in that sense, I'm very excited that we're seeing the federal program shift and help us with that inevitable transition of the fleet to electrification. So we have been working on this for years. We actually stood up the West Coast Electric Highway in partnership with WashDOT more than a decade ago with a system of fast chargers along our major corridors. We're recapitalizing that today, and then with the IIJA, we're going to get over $50 million in federal funding in order to expand that, deepen that, add additional chargers along our major corridors. And we've supplemented that with about another $50 million in resources that will help us with other elements. Professor Sperling mentioned that a lot of folks living in multifamily housing don't really have access. We need to be able to have penetration of charging stations into those neighborhoods and workplaces as well. So we're really focusing on electrification of the system as a way to meet our climate commitments. And also very excited, there's a new carbon reduction program. I've shortened that to the CARP. So that is an area where we see an opportunity to partner with local governments, our metropolitan planning organizations, and other areas really in order to be able to make additional investments across all modes, across various areas that will help us with reducing carbon emissions across the transportation system. So that's going to be very exciting. The one note of caution I'll give you, and I think we need to be very excited about the IIJA, but also look at it with clear eyes. I had one of our economists do an analysis of how much money we're getting in the IIJA compared to what if the feds had just indexed funding in 2010 to inflation. IIJA represents a 4% increase in federal funding in real terms over that time period, at least for Oregon. I think we're probably fairly typical. So I always say 2 cheers for the IIJA. It's great. It represents a major investment, but it really gets the federal government back to a level of investment that was consistent with the investments back in the Safe-T-Lou area, not actually a massive reinvestment. So in that sense, I think a lot of our states and local governments are still going to be largely on the hook for the infrastructure and especially the transformation of the system we need to see over time. For context, in Oregon, when the legislature passed our Keep Oregon Moving Act in 2017, that represents a investment that's 2.5 times as large on an annual basis as the IIJA. So again, go IIJA, but we need to be a little bit clear-eyed about what it really represents in terms of the opportunity for the transportation system.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Brandy DeLang. I'm one of the government relations advocates at the Association of Washington Cities. That's just a really nice way, or a really less evil way of saying lobbyist. So I am one of those people that goes down to the Capitol every day and talks about all those policy issues and all the nuances related to the policy issues that the legislature is working on. I think I have a really unique role on this panel today because I do represent all 281 of our cities within the state, and we aren't just focused on transportation, we're also focused on the infrastructure investments that are being made in IIJA, or formerly known IIJA BIL. I think one of the things that we're most excited about is how local governments have been really kind of centered and prioritized in BIL in this case. In many previous years, unfortunately, I think local governments kind of been on the edges of the conversations. And certainly I agree the investments made in IIJA are not nearly to the level that we need, specifically for our preservation and maintenance needs that we have currently, but it is the first time that we're really seeing a deeper, stronger discussion around the challenges associated with federal funds and the things that we need at the local level. The other thing I just want to kind of quickly note as well is the intersection between transportation infrastructure and then critical traditional infrastructure, as well as broadband infrastructure. I think it's a really important moment to recognize and acknowledge that as local governments in particular, we really are trying to adjust and integrate all of these things all at the same time, right? We're trying to ensure that our communities are getting broadband. We're trying to ensure that our roads are in decent shape and that our water systems, whether they're drinking water or wastewater, are being adequately taken care of. And often that means that we're working to apply for a number of different federal resources or local resources and leveraging them with one another. So this is a really unique opportunity to hit all of those critical needs all at once and leverage those funds. So, I think if you talk to my members across the state, they would say this is, again, a great opportunity, but it certainly doesn't fill the entire gaps that we have.
Very good points. And so that does lead me to the question, and Travis brought this up, there's been a lot of investment over the years. We've been investing more locally and at the state level. And so each of your states have its own transportation package. So two were passed very recently. So Move Ahead Washington, Leading Idaho, and Keep Oregon Moving, which is still going, provides additional funding to it. And so how are these funding streams now, how are you thinking about these funding streams and complementing what the IIJA is bringing to the table, and how are you starting to manage those? We'll dive into that question a little bit more next, but can you share some of that?
Yeah, so similar to Oregon and other states, Washington really is a self-help state. We've had four major transportation packages in the last 15 years, most recently Move Ahead Washington. And what's great about that is our state's values have really aligned with the federal values in IIJA. And so in some cases, it provides the necessary match that we need to be able to seek the federal funds or to have projects, developed enough to seek the federal funds. It's important to point out that in Washington state, which is a little bit different than in other states, our legislature appropriates all of our federal money. So the legislature, when they pass a revenue package like this, they look at all the revenue sources that they have available, and in this case, they incorporated in all of the IIJA funding, and then they have an associated project list that goes with that says, okay, here's how we're going to fund these efforts. And so with the eligibility and the priorities in IIJA, that was a really good fit for the priorities of the state legislature, kind of moving more towards, multimodal and environmental justice and sustainability. All of those things are aligning very well. Again, though, if you were to look at the project list of what's being funded with IIJA, we mostly use that money for preservation projects. So bridge painting is not sexy, but it's so important to maintain, what we have. So, yeah.
Well, like I said earlier, with Idaho growing as rapidly as it is, and the new funding mechanisms that are coming from our legislature, we were still, it was like drinking from a fire hose for a lot of it. And we're looking at projects that, we've wanted to do, but we knew we were never really going to get the funding for. With the additional funding that we're getting from IIJA, we're actually able to look at even more and how we can utilize and cross over from the IIJA into the funding that we're getting to enhance our data systems, to enhance a lot of things where we need information, we need those practical things in order to be able to design, in order to be able to actually bring something to fruition. And so a lot of where things are pairing up between the IIJA and all of our funding initiatives that are coming out of our legislature, we're able to do that second piece where we weren't sure how we were going to get it done. So, for example, when we're doing research on some of the safety projects that we're looking at, one of the things that we're using some of the additional funding for is going to be things like how do we vet our data, and so we're really taking it down to a practical level. So we're trying to hit it at everything from the grants themselves all the way down to how we invest with purpose in developing the projects that we foresee coming. And it's going to be a great opportunity to actually take some of those projects where we really needed two components. We needed not just the transportation system, but we needed that local system to be able to fund their portion of it because it was not going to be something. And so these partnerships that are coming out of the IIJA, as we're identifying with our additional funding from the state, are going to be key in actually bringing some of these things to fruition.
I think in Oregon, much like in Washington, we saw that there was a lot of alignment between the direction and values that were expressed in the IIJA and the direction we had been going, whether it was through HB 2017, which took the first steps in significant investments in electric vehicles through a rebate program for them, or whether it was in equity and safety and additional funding for multimodal mobility. So we see a lot of complementary, that's not a word, the IIJA complements the investments and the direction we've been going with our strategic action plan and the investments we've been making in Oregon in recent years across all those areas. We also saw significant investment in bridges in the IIJA, which was very helpful. We did get a significant investment in bridges in the Keep Oregon Moving package, but even with both of these investments, we're currently at a place where we have about 2,700 bridges on the state highway system. We're replacing an average of 3 of those per year. So we're on a 900-year replacement cycle. There's a lot of things that last 900 years, cathedrals, et cetera, but most of our interstate era bridges were not designed to last 900 years. So we still have some significant challenges, regardless of the investments that have been made at the state and federal level.
So again, I think I have maybe a more nuanced or unique view in the overall conversation around federal funds and the statewide packages that are passed here in Washington related to transportation. Candidly, the Move Ahead package this last session was both a win and also a loss for cities. Many of my members received really significant funding for very important projects, and that's a huge win. But overall, unfortunately, preservation and maintenance needs were not invested in cities or counties, actually, for that matter. And it was a challenge for us. We understood the landscape that we were dealing with and kind of the nuance of this situation, but it was a significant challenge. Because Washington does have a really unique process, though, when it comes to federal funds, we had a second chance at the apple, if you will, and we were able to sit down and negotiate out with WashDOT and with the governor's office and with others some of the federal funds that are coming into the state. And in that, I believe that we walked away with some pretty significant wins. We saw greater investments in bridges. We are now directing funds to address fish barrier removal. We're working on a federal exchange program that I think will significantly benefit my membership to help kind of remove some of the barriers associated with federal funds. So again, certainly the Move Ahead package was a historic package for our state, but really kind of left mixed feelings for a number of my members.
Sorry, no worries. All right, so that's And that leads me to another question, and I'm going to start with you, Brandy, because you're going to have this challenge as well. The IIJA funds flow to the states and to local governments through a myriad of formula and grant programs. Last I counted, there were over 100 programs. There's new formula programs. I think over the years, states have got comfortable with certain formula. The money's kept coming in the same way. We have the carbon reduction program. We have the National Electric Vehicle infrastructure program. And all of these have different deadlines, requirements. It's not just that you get the money. You have you have to do certain things, particularly the grants, the competitive funds. That actually requires a lot of effort sometimes to put together applications, to know when the notice of funding is coming out, competing notice of fundings. And so there's a lot of challenges for jurisdictions to secure those funds. And so that's why I wanted to start with you, Brandy. How are the cities navigating this new landscape? There's historic money coming to cities, but you have to go out and get it. Also talk a little bit about how you might be collaborating regionally so that our entire region can secure more funding. Is there something like that in the horizon?
Yeah, so I think you really paint a good picture of what our folks are dealing with, frankly. This is such uncharted territory, and yet it's not. We consistently hear from our membership that navigating the federal process is incredibly cumbersome, and it really is so cumbersome that many of our folks just decide not to apply for funds. And then moreover, the additional challenge is if they do decide to apply for funds and receive those funds, there are a number of requirements and reporting elements that they have to navigate that become overly burdensome and that frankly many of our folks fail at. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that we work on with, and it's kind of unique to Washington, I believe, is that there's a group of state agencies that are out there. Actually, they're meeting next week, and a number of our folks go to this conference and essentially get technical assistance to navigate some of these grant processes. AWC, we've tried to put together a bit of a landing page, if you will, where we just try to push out all of the NOFOs. We try to push out all of the funding opportunities that are out there just to get it on people's radar, because frankly, that is kind of the first issue at hand. There are so many opportunities out there right now, and nobody is aware of all of them. It's just almost impossible to keep track. The other thing, though, that I think we're currently trying to grapple with and figuring out is where can the state come in and provide assistance, and where can we have those conversations with legislators on that front? So I think I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that we've historically seen with our membership is matching funds that are usually required in federal programs, and certainly in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a number of programs now that don't require matching funds, or they have a different criteria associated with that, but there's still quite a few that do. And so I think we're pretty interested in trying to figure out if there's a way to encourage the state to create some sort of pot of money that can be used to provide leveraging. I know there have been some conversations around that, and so we're really encouraged to know that there are some preliminary conversations out there. I think the other thing too, simply, is just we try to encourage our folks to find the right consultant too, frankly. There are some consultants out there that really know how to navigate this process, and that's great, but then there are some that just don't. And unfortunately, it costs our cities more time, more money, and they don't receive those funds, or they're not obligating the funds in the way that they need to. The last thing I do want to mention, and I would be remiss if I don't mention this, is I think especially with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the current period of time that we're in, one of the challenges that we aren't sure how we'll face yet is the inflationary costs of work. And the workforce issues that go with that. So in past years, as I've said, matching funds and just navigating the federal process as a whole has been its own issue. But now, because we're seeing this high increase of supplies, and because we're seeing this unique issue in the workforce where we can't get people to work, or we have a bunch of really educated and institutional knowledge folks retiring, and we can't now recruit people into our communities, that's creating an additional barrier that I don't have the answer to yet. And again, I'm kind of like knocking on wood that in this incoming session, the legislature will be thoughtful of and consider things like apprentice programs and, you know, different ways to try to encourage folks to come to some of those smaller and less resourced communities to help navigate this process.
Thank you. And now we're going to turn to our state representatives, and maybe you could answer some of those questions, but I put you on the spot.
No, I have no answers. I have only questions.
But I do want you to talk a little bit about your workforce issues as well as you go through, right, those challenges, because I think it's relevant.
Yeah, I can do that. And just starting on the local government side, you know, in Oregon, local governments got more than $300 million out of the IIJA and just direct funding that came either through formula to local governments or that we passed through in various ways. And when I went out to the League of Oregon Cities conference in the spring and explained this to them, I created a little summary of all the programs, and it ran to like 6 pages in the short version. I'm like, damn, this is complicated. I mean, and to your point, it can be really difficult for local governments that are not well resourced to be able to navigate that complexity. And that's just the formula programs, much less all of the competitive programs. Mm-hmm. In Oregon, we have traditionally used a lot of what we call fund exchange, where we swap out, you know, we give a grant to local governments in federal dollars, and they come to us and say, you don't really want to use federal because of all the strings. And so we say, okay, here's the same amount of money in state dollars. Unfortunately, given some funding constraints we have on the non-capital operating or operations and maintenance side, we actually are starting to pull back from that. So it comes as federal funding is ramping up, we're actually pulling back from our ability to swap out federal for state funds. So that is increasingly challenging. You know, for us in Oregon, we actually, I think, are the most generous state in the nation in terms of the share of the state highway fund that goes to local government. So I think fewer of our member local jurisdictions have problems with matching funds, but it certainly is an issue there. In terms of workforce challenges, it's just like you name the workforce area, you name a problem. And, you know, to quote Notorious B.I.G., you know, the more money we come across, the more problems we see. That is a real big challenge for us right now, is finding workers in any area. I just got a report, you know, our DMV is under me, and they're doing better. They've only got a 15% vacancy rate in their front office staff. But I just heard the other day, you know, we can't get skilled iron workers out to our jobs. We can't get our staff for us to do our project delivery staffing, for engineering, for contract management. So you name it, we got the problems. I will say, though, that we are taking some proactive steps to try to address those. We have long put a portion of our state and federal funds into workforce development programs. On the construction side, with paying through our Bureau of Labor and Industries, we fund a lot of apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship work programs. We've actually ramped that up. We're putting an additional $7 million of IIJA funding into workforce and small business support, and we're hopeful that that will help in the long run. We're also doing some work around increasing our apprenticeship requirements on our projects in order to try to build that pipeline of apprenticeships moving forward. So we do think we have some potential solutions, but these are painfully slow. When you're talking about getting skilled workers onto transportation projects, you don't just hire somebody, give them a hard hat and a vest and tools and say, go build the thing. That's not how it works. So we're going to be, I think, for years in challenges. You know, I, being a economics nerd, I check the Federal Reserve's labor force participation rate on a monthly basis. We're at 82.7% prime age labor force participation rate, which tells you there's a reason why we can't hire people. It's not that people don't want to work, there just are not the workers. There's a variety of reasons for that, from slowing immigration to all sorts of other factors, but we're going to be in this challenge for a while, and we're going to need to find all the solutions. We're actually even looking at using some of our IIJA funds internally. There's an expanded opportunity to use these funds to develop pipelines for workers into state DOTs. So we're looking to use some of those funds to increase the number of internships we offer, increase our workforce development programs for people internal to the agency. So we are going to be pulling up all the stops to try to build that skilled workforce in the long run.
Ditto. All of the challenges that you're talking about are ones that we're facing as well. The reality is that Most of our highway districts, most of our cities are very small. Our mayor is part-time, 5 hours a week. He's also the person who has to oversee any engineering that may be going on in his town that has 1.2 miles of road in it. So these are the challenges that we're facing. We have all these opportunities, and we're trying to do as much outreach as possible at the transportation department. And that includes things like going to the local highway district planning conference actually next month. It's doing personal outreach. It's putting together a newsletter that goes out every week that lists out all of the grants that are going to be due in the next month, along with an education piece, so that somebody who's never actually tried a grant can answer the questions and know all of the steps that have to occur. And it's this constant talking and building relationships, but that also is very much in line with what we do at ITD. If you look at our strategic plan, and it talks about safety and mobility and customer service, things like that, everything is community centered. And so we've put a lot of stock and a lot of time into building those relationships, but we are still running into the same challenges. We're looking at workforce challenges. We're looking at how do we retain our own people within ITD, let alone getting enough people out into the community that can help build those grants and consultants and things like that. How do we get the matching funds? How do we make sure that people know that the opportunities are even available? I mean, if we're talking about partnering with Fish and Game in the transportation department, that's easy because they understand the federal process. But when you're looking at, Atomic City, there's a population, 1,000? They don't. I mean, they don't know what's there, and that is the majority of our state. So we're running into all of these challenges just as well. The workforce, how do you actually get trained staff on board at the DOT? How do you get them out in the community and the consultants and actually be able to schedule the projects? It's, like I said earlier, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's trying to figure out how we're going to invest with intention and towards safety and mobility. So.
Yeah, same. Secretary Millar likes to joke that between the IIJA package and then our Move Ahead Washington package, that we're the dog that caught the car. And so we have challenges there. As Brandy referenced earlier, we have a unique process in Washington State where it's normally the governor's office, but this year it was the legislature convenes an advisory group of jurisdictions that are eligible to receive federal highway formula money, and they talk about what the split should be between state and local governments. And when I say local, I mean everybody that's not the state. So that's cities, counties, tribes, transits, ports, anybody who's eligible for those formula monies. And overall, the recommendation out of the advisory group that met this spring was that 41% of all the formula money that's coming to the state will go to local jurisdictions. Some of that will be straight pass-through, some of that will be through competitive statewide grant programs that the state administers. So Travis, I would submit we give the most money to locals, but we can—
On the federal side,
we
yes.
can do a spreadsheet
side,
later.
I think we're probably a little bit
Okay. that might be true. So it's a good process, but there are things that we're struggling to figure out, as Brandy mentioned, like how could we do swaps? The way that our legislature appropriates our federal funds, it's a little bit more challenging, but we're looking at the examples from Oregon and other places to see what might be possible. We're also committed to trying to coordinate on the grant programs. I count 22 grant programs now in IIJA that the state is eligible for. And there are some that local jurisdictions are eligible for that we're not. And so, trying to take that big picture look. In the past, when there was only a handful, a NOFA would come out, we'd do a call for projects internally and say, hey, which projects do you think might be a good fit? Our exec team would meet, we'd pick the 3 that we were allotted and submit and advocate for them. And now there's 22. And so we aspire to look ahead for the life of the bill and say, okay, what might be a good fit? But then also talking with our partners to say, what's on your plate? What do you have teed up that might be a good fit? Where might we collaborate? This last year, we applied for a RAISE grant with Yakima Nation on one of their trail projects, and we won a raise grant for that, and that felt really good. So, we're looking at that, but we also have a lot of challenges for workforce, everything that they mentioned. And even within the DOT, I have regional offices when we're like, all right, here's this grant program, what do you got? And they're like, stop, stop asking us to fund more projects. I can't deliver the stuff that we already have on the plate. So between the amount of people that we have retiring or that have retired, and we don't pay as much as everybody else does, so we try and be an employer of choice, where we've really embraced the telework model and support for things, so we're trying to do that. We also are really looking at, and have been for a while, barriers to employment. And reaching out to communities that we previously hadn't, as an agency, and looking for opportunities there. So, but I agree, it's not going to be a quick solve. I'll also note, though, that it doesn't seem like anybody's in a good place when it comes to workforce. All of our contractors and consultant partners and others, they're all saying the same thing. No one seems to have quite figured it out. So we're going to keep trying.
Excellent. So let's turn it into maybe a little bit more positive and low-hanging fruit here. Are there any specific areas that come to mind where academia or the private sector, who's here today, might be able to effectively support you? What would be your advice for academics and for the private sector, and what should they be thinking about? And you can mix it up however you want this time.
Sure. Okay, so we really appreciate our partnerships with academia and the private sector. I think some of the, research projects that are kind of top of mind right now for us are really in the technology space, electric vehicles, electric ferries, coordination in that realm, also sustainability, culverts, how to address the effects of climate change and carbon reduction, and safety. We've seen our safety numbers, are going in the wrong direction, and how do we best correct that? So just off the top, those are some of the areas where we're really doing collaboration now and really see a need for future collaboration.
It might make sense for me to kind of follow Megan and some of the comments that she's making. So, I think certainly from our perspective, we are very interested in the EV conversation and really thinking about too where we can start to see infrastructure be built out so that we can have a sustainable model especially for some of our more rural communities that are very interested in EVs, but really just frankly don't have the resources or the infrastructure or really even know where to begin. And as alluded to, there's a ton of money within the BIL to really support EVs. So I think that's one area. Another area, though, and we're currently working on it now, but certainly I think that there's always more work to be done, is equity in transportation. So one of the things that our members are really focused on and are trying to really break into the space on is rethinking the way that they invest in their transportation, rethinking in the way that they're maintaining and preserving their transportation infrastructure and what that means in an equity, with an equity lens. And while certainly there's a number of our cities who are making some pretty significant inroads in this area, there's a number of our cities that are not. So I think any work that's being done around there will be hugely informative and will frankly provide another resource to our folks that they don't currently have.
Yeah, I can give basically a second to that, or third, because I think you actually said the same thing, basically. In terms of a lot of our research needs, I think are in the future are going to be focused on sustainability and electrification and equity as well. These are areas where, I think state DOTs have, probably underinvested in the past. And certainly, most of us are making a significant shift in that area. Some of us have shifted more, in the past. Oregon has long been focused pretty heavily on sustainability. And so we will need a lot more work in this area. I think of there's the work that is done at UTCs and universities and in academia really complements, with the basic research that you undertake, and then the applied research that we take and do that to get it to a real world level of applicability. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities to partner on some of that. We in recent years have done some work on, say, equity and safety. We did a research project just a couple of years ago that looked at the differential outcomes between communities of color and low-income communities and other parts of the state, and found that, particularly for pedestrians and bicyclists, there were very significant differences in outcomes where people living in those areas had less access to safe infrastructure and thus were more likely to get hit and killed at very high rates in comparison to other areas. So that was just an example of doing some research that looked at those safety outcomes in a way we hadn't really in the past. I mean, the data we collect is not particularly amenable to that, and so we had to look at some creative ways to do it by census blocks and find those correlations. So I think we're going to want to partner with all of you in finding ways to get those conversations and get that research on sustainability and equity to a much deeper level than I think we have in the past.
So I think in some of the challenges that we face that I think research would benefit us in the future, and in looking at a rural state like ours, when we're talking about how do we reduce carbon emissions and things like that, I mean, we've got to start with the foundations. How do we actually put in the infrastructure? I mean, Idaho has one north-south corridor, and they will only ever have one north-south corridor, and that's because we have a massive roadless territory in the middle of it. We have a couple of east-west corridors. We're not a lot of roads, but we have a long distance between exits on the interstate. You can drive 50, 60 miles and not see one. So how do we actually establish an infrastructure in a rural community that is highly agriculture, highly timber-oriented, with pockets of tourism all throughout? So how we address putting in the basics like charging stations and things like that are going to be some of the things that we're going to be looking at. It's also going to be, again, looking at some of the very practical things. Our communities don't have the resources necessarily. They don't necessarily have the information that they need in order to do this stuff. So we're looking at, and even if they do have, somebody comes in and hands them data and says, hey, here's some information, why don't you go apply for something? How do they know it's the right information, or that it's accurate, or that it's usable? So some of the things that we're looking at is how can we create a way for people to vet their data? And it seems simple, but it's so necessary because it comes down to that very foundational thing. How do we provide what our community needs in order to utilize the funding opportunities that are being given? And not just our local communities, but us within the DOT itself. I mean, we are looking at our own internal outreach and saying, is this sufficient? Are we addressing the needs that we have? So a lot of it's going to be looking at those very practical, foundational things of how we address grants and how we address funding opportunities within a very rural state, because we don't have the large urban areas. We don't have, I mean, well, we do, we have one. But then we have some other smaller urban areas, large urban areas, but we're also very spread out. So.
Thank you so much. I think we still have some time for a few questions. Can I? 2 questions. Okay, 2 audience questions. If you have any questions for the panel, please feel free to come up. I think that's the mic. Oh, there's the mic.
Thanks a lot for the interesting discussion. I heard a lot about workforce needs, and you mentioned about a lot of projects but don't have people to deliver. At the same time, people want to work, but they may not have the right skill set. University is normally the place try to provide training to people, right? Including the working professionals. So PacTrans set up the Workforce Development Institute in 2020. We have delivered a bunch of courses. So we are certainly very willing to help. If you could prioritize some key topics, I think we can start to work on those things to help you.